Professor Ramsay Cook, The Maple Leaf Forever, Essays on Nationalism and Politics in Canada. You're a professor at York University in the History Department, and you're in the news. Your book, The Maple Leaf Forever, Essays on Nationalism and Politics in Canada, this raised the question of what you mean by nationalism, and there's been some controversy about this because some people say you are an anti-nationalist at a time when others in Canada are becoming more nationalist.
Mm-hmm.
Now, there's a problem of language here, I think.
Yes. I think nationalism is a conception of a country as a culturally and politically homogeneous place. And out of that kind of conception, you can devise a kind of set of symbols and an emotion and an ideology in the last analysis, which to me seems to be a kind of straitjacket into which people simply have to somehow or other come and fit. The ideology of the United States is something called the American way of life. I don't think there is anything called the Canadian way of life, and I think there are many ways of being Canadian, and I think that's, if you want to make me sound like a nationalist, that's what I think is different about Canada, and that's what appeals to me, and that's what I want to preserve, and that's what I want to see go on living and growing. So that I consider myself to be someone who's very strongly in favor of the continuation of Canada, but not in the terms that one sees in traditional nationalist writers in Canada. You can go back through the whole history of our country, French and English, and find many, particularly in the intellectual community, many examples of this kind of ideological nationalist that I'm talking about. And as soon as you begin to dissect those people, you discover that they're talking a language which is completely unacceptable to large other segments of the Canadian community, either to the French Canadians or to the Western Canadians, or in the French Canadian case to English Canadians in Ontario or in the Canadian West. So that's the kind of nationalism that I find that I can't accept. I also can't accept it for a second reason, and that is that it seems to me to be a kind of global explanation and therefore a global solution to a whole variety of problems which have to be approached in a much more concrete way.
Specifically?
Well, it seems to me that we very often get terribly upset in Canada about some problems that exist here. Let's say the issue of foreign investment in Canada. And the way in which we try to resolve this problem is by developing a kind of heady, emotional anti-Americanism. Whereas it seems to me that the way to look at that problem is not to look at the question of sort of why the Americans are here and say, you know, it's their fault, they're undermining and ruining our country, but to look at the Canadian context and try and answer that question, to see how it was that we, in effect, invited American investment to Canada and for what purposes. And are those purposes now exhausted? If they are exhausted, then let's try and work out new means of dealing with the kind of problem that exists. But let's not say totally and completely try and commit ourselves to the proposition that we don't want any foreign investment because it seems now to be bad. Try and find out where we don't need it, where we do need it, what useful purpose it serves, or what useless purposes it serves. And I put that on the other side, too. It seems to me that there's another kind of Canadian who's inclined to say, look, this kind of program worked very well in the United States. Let's have one here. And that, again, I think, comes at the problem from the wrong end. We may indeed, obviously we do, we live in the 20th century in North America, have some kinds of problems which are similar to those of the United States. Urban problems, for example. It seems to me that one of the ways we've tried to solve this problem in Toronto is we've looked at American cities and seen, at least we thought we saw, that giant expressways were a solution to problems of urban congestion. We looked at a time when they seemed to be, and so we began to build them for ourselves and discovered that in fact, or at least we may discover that in fact, they create more problems than they solve. If we go back and look at the United States again, I think that is the case. What I really am trying to argue is that we should look at our own problems within our own terms, certainly look at the way other kinds of people in other communities have tried to solve them, but remember that this is a community which has its own roots and that we need to come to certain kinds of solutions to problems within our own terms.
Are you really restating in a new way the familiar Canadian proposition that we're a cluster of minorities?
Well, I hadn't really thought of it that way, but perhaps that's true, yes. I think we are a variegated society. It's John Porter calls it a vertical mosaic. Most of us who don't like to look quite as deeply as John has into this problem call it a mosaic and assume that we're all sort of horizontally stretched out in this mosaic, and of course that isn't true. But it is a mosaic society, and I think it has to be coped with in those terms.
Now, you use the word the nation state in the book, and you make an important distinction between nationalism and the state.
Mm-hmm.
Would you like to explain that? Because I think this is pretty central to your argument, isn't it?
Yeah, I think it's the most fundamental thing in my argument. It seems to me that the distinction is between what I would call a nation-state and a nationalist state. A nationalist state seems to me to be a state which is based on a kind of cultural, and I use the term cultural in the broadest sense of that term, both material culture and spiritual culture, on cultural homogeneity, and that it defines the people who live in it by the way in which they belong to that particular cultural or ethnic or national group. And that policies are devised in such a state to make people increasingly conform to those kinds of dictates. Whereas it seems to me a national state is really a kind of, is really very simply a political organization, that it provides a framework within which various kinds of people can live and work toward, one would hope, frequently common goals, but also that they can find within that framework ways of working out perhaps different solutions to particular kinds of problems that they have. And a state, therefore, that recognizes these differences and in effect says these differences are good and are desirable. There are many ways of trying to solve problems that human beings have in the modern world, and why accept one solution when you may have the possibility of buying or borrowing from a variety of kinds of solutions?
Now, within this arrangement of groups of people who have, as it were, a kind of contract. You're describing a kind of contract.
Yes, that's right.
In a sense. Can you build in enough flexibility into the contract to keep them balanced one with another?
Well, that's the essence of the problem, of course. I think it's got to be an experience in which the terms of the contract, so to speak, grow with the community. And that if one section of the community feels that the original contract was suitable perhaps for 100 or more years ago, but is no longer suitable, the people who live in that society have to be prepared to sit down and look at the terms of that contract and say, yes, you're right, or no, you're wrong, but one or the other. There have to be some modifications. There have to be some changes. The history of Canada seems to me to be in very large part the history of a continuing accommodation particularly between French and English, but also between the varying sectional groups. For example, you can argue, as some historians would argue, that in 1867 the British North America Act set down the terms of the relationship between the French and the English in this country and placed a very restricted, a pretty restricted definition of what the rights of French Canadians were outside of the province of Quebec. Such people would argue now that with French Canadians discontented about that, well, they just have to accept something that they accepted 100 years ago. Well, I simply don't believe that. I think that if the conditions have changed, then we have to look at this problem once again and say, obviously, if we want to have an accommodation here between these people, you've got to find some way of meeting what they now consider to be their larger demands. I don't think the British North America Act settled for all times the question of French language rights in this country any more than it settled for all times the issue of whether we should have unemployment insurance or not. We didn't have any in 1867. We have it now. It's a kind of accommodation to changing social conditions. So I think that it always is a delicate kind of balance. And as long as people are prepared to have this kind of open-ended view that the nation wasn't born full-blooded in 1867, and that's the way it always had to be, and it seems to me you can have a continuing accommodation.
You grew up in the prairies.
That's right, yes.
In which part?
I was born in Saskatchewan, and I lived in Saskatchewan for 10 years, and I subsequently moved to Manitoba, where I lived for the next about 14 years of my life. In fact, I was never east of Lake of the Woods until I was about 22 or 3 years old.
Has all that affected your way of looking at Canadian history?
Oh, I think it probably has affected it quite considerably. I think in some, at least, of my general values and so on, I remain a Westerner in my outlook. I think particularly in the sense of having a kind of Westerners feeling that what often is claimed to be national policy is really Ontario policy or central Canadian policy. I think in that sense. I think also in the sense that, and this becomes harder and harder to say, of course, in Ontario, but I think in the sense of having had a feeling for a community in the West in which there were a great variety of different kinds of people in terms of their ethnic or national origin, that I never had any sense of Canada being primarily an English-speaking or Anglo-Saxon country. In most of the small towns that I lived in the Canadian West, there probably wasn't an Anglo-Saxon majority. So I think that perhaps influenced my thinking somewhat.
But you're now known as one of the foremost students of the history of French Canada and the relations of French Canada to the rest of the country. Did that begin in your time in the West?
No, I don't think it really did. As a matter of fact, of all of the ethnic groups that I had contact with when I was young in the West, I think the French Canadians were probably the least noticeable.
Were you from a bilingual family?
No, I wasn't from a bilingual family at all. English was the only language of our household, and apart from what we learned in school in French, which wasn't very much. Although, in fact, I did have in high school a Franco-Manitoban as a French teacher, but that didn't make any particular impact on me, I don't think. My interest in French Canada, I think, and I would perhaps add one further point, that even at the University of Manitoba, I was at one of the colleges in the university system, and one of the other colleges in the system was at St. Boniface, or St. Boniface as we call it in Manitoba, and one had very little, I had very little contact with Franco-Manitobans at St. Boniface, which was fairly normal for, I think, most English-speaking students. My interest in the subject, I guess, developed since I came to the East. We were moving into the time when things were beginning to get quite exciting again in the province of Quebec. And I felt that increasingly that a great deal of our history was written and taught without very much knowledge of the French-Canadian side of things. And I had begun to do a great deal of reading of French-Canadian writers, and eventually decided that I would try and do some teaching in this area, and that led, as these things always do, into some research.
I'd like to ask you about something you said in an earlier book, not in this new book, The Maple Leaf Forever, but the book you wrote about French Canada, came out 2-3 years ago. There's a reference, if I may quote out of context a little bit, that English Canadians and French Canadians have never understood one another's purposes. I wonder if I could ask you first, is that generally speaking true of the historians of Canada? Have French historians understood English Canadian historians and vice versa, and have they understood each other's backgrounds?
No, my feeling here is that there has been a gap, or to use that cliche, a kind of two solitudes in the historical profession as well as elsewhere in Canadian life. Although that may be not entirely fair, because the Canadian Historical Association has always been a quite effective organization in bringing together both French and English-speaking historians. I think I would make the further comment, perhaps, that English-Canadian historians have, over the course of a rather long period of time, perhaps shown more interest in French Canada than is the case with French-Canadian historians, who I think have been very, very much concerned primarily with what they consider as their own past. One can think of a list of, a short list, admittedly, but a list of English-Canadian historians going back to George Wrong before the First World War and after the First World War, and Arthur Lower, for example, or Professor Bill Eccles, now at the University of Toronto, people of this sort who've had a really considerable interest in French-Canadian matters. Now, I can't think of a single book written by a French-Canadian, at least offhand, about peculiarly English-Canadian problems. particularly if those problems don't in any way touch upon the relations between French and English. The English appear in the history of French Canada by French Canadians primarily where they come into contact with French Canadians, and particularly where that contact appears at least to be in a kind of oppressor's role.
So if this is the case at the level of the university historian, that is the most thoroughly informed, perhaps, of the historians, it's likely then to trickle down through the school system and affect the way kids, in fact, learn about their country.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I think that's true. I wouldn't speak with great authority about high school textbooks, but it does seem to me that on the whole, the material in most of the school textbooks, after the period of the explorations and so on, the history of Canada becomes very much the history, really, of English-speaking Canada, again with the French Canadians coming in whenever they make an impact on our general national political life. If you've got a Laurier as Prime Minister, obviously you've got to say something about that. But it's relatively limited, it seems to me, and always has been. And I think that goes through the whole structure of our school curriculums, at least in the past it has. When one deals with literature, for example, Canadian literature, the tendency is to deal with English-Canadian literature, partly, of course, because of the problem of the language and the difficulties of studying literature, at least in translation.
Yeah. Going back to your quotation about the English and French peoples never having understood one another's purposes, what in the larger sense were you getting at there?
Well, it seems to me that this really reflects a kind of failure on the part, on the one hand, of English-speaking Canadians to understand that French-speaking Canadians have always had a very strong desire to live and grow according to their own traditions and toward the dictates of their own culture, one might say. That we have tended, I think, to see French Canadians as being primarily a minority group in the country that has sometimes fitted in with the general purposes as we English Canadians see them of the country, and sometimes not, and when not, at being rather troublesome.
You also put some emphasis in your books on the fact that the French Canadian will tend sometimes, French Canadian intellectuals at any rate, will tend sometimes to speak of English Canadian as a sort of monolithic unit, and not recognize that there are in fact tremendous varieties of English-speaking Canadians who have backgrounds other than English-speaking, some of whom are still speaking other languages.
Yes. Well, I of course don't believe that there is such a thing as an English-Canadian nation. That is to say, in a kind of homogeneous sense, either culturally or even politically. I think that this country has always been characterized by great regional and ethnic differences, and that one of the problems of the country, and perhaps even of the people who write about this country, is to make an assumption that in a way what goes on in Ottawa is what really happens in the whole of the country. And I think we're paying the price right now for that kind of view, in the sense of all kinds of regional, what shall I say, discontents re-emerging in this country. But certainly the French Canadian, I think, has tended to look upon English Canadians as being a kind of homogeneous group. In the old days, we were always looked upon as being Orangistes. We were all Orangemen, whether we belonged to the lodge or not. Well, of course, that's a sad misconception and total misinterpretation of the character of the country. And even to the degree that it's a proper characterization of Anglo-Saxon, so to speak, Canadians, and I don't think it's a proper characterization of even them, it totally ignores the large number of non-Anglo-Saxon Canadians who've come to live in this country and played a pretty considerable role in its growth and development.
Yeah. Is this an insight that a Westerner is especially apt to have, do you think?
Well, I think that it is to some very considerable degree. As a Westerner, you know, I often ask myself the question: did the War of 1812 have anything to do with me? It was never given much emphasis in the history that I was taught in my youth. It was something that took place down in the East before we ever really existed. Well, I guess as a Canadian, I think that the War of 1812 was my war in some sense, but for the part of the country I come from, it's not really a very meaningful experience, I don't think.
You're saying something that I suppose, in a sense, we all feel, that history's means something when it has touched you very personally in some way, when you can see and touch it all around you. is that a special problem in this country, where the history is spread over such an enormous amount of space, and in fact over 400 years in time? We're not a young country, though, if people go on saying so.
Yeah. Oh, sure, I think it's a very special problem. A country which, what you're saying is really that the country developed in an uneven way historically. That there were people living in what we now call Quebec back at the beginning of the 17th century. And apart from the native populations of Canada, there were, of course, no significant numbers of people in the Canadian West until well into the 19th century, so that the historical experiences of all these people are very different. And of course, in the case of Ontario, we talk about the post-American Revolutionary period. So that I think for many young Canadians, the history of New France, many young English-speaking Canadians, the history of New France may have a certain romance and excitement about it, but it's not really their history. Their ancestors didn't come 300 years ago and begin this settlement. And I think for them it's a kind of, I don't want to say a foreign history, but it certainly isn't something in which they perhaps feel a direct involvement. For them, it's really once Governor Simcoe and company come to Upper Canada, the Loyalists come and so on, or as you move further west, when you begin to get white settlement and when you begin to get really substantial white settlement, then you get, I think, a greater sense of the reality of history to such people.
I have a feeling, reading your books, and not only from your books, that historians are very conscious of the difficulties in Canadian history, the difficulties between peoples. Not the difficulties you were suggesting earlier of just plain survival in a very difficult country. Not the difficulties of establishing some kind of an economic base, but really, I suppose, in a sense, political difficulties. Has this been overstressed at the expense of other aspects of our development which were perhaps real achievements?
Well, I think that the historian, to some degree, suffers from, and with less excuse, perhaps, suffers from the same problem as a journalist suffers from. That is to say, he writes about the things that were exciting in his mind in the past. So you write about the times that you write primarily about the times when there were problems, when there was a crisis, when there were difficulties, and so on. And not to minimize the present difficulties in which we live in Canada, I must say that I'm sometimes impressed by the fact that if you go back and read the newspapers or the politicians' papers or the journals and so on of the period, people are always talking about crises. And somehow or other we got through them. And therefore it may be that historians and others haven't placed enough emphasis upon the things that do keep this country hanging together, which is perhaps the ordinary people of this country in facing the sorts of problems they do opening up a new country.
One of the most distinguished of senior historians in this country, Frank Underhill, has said that a nation is a group of people who have banded together to do great things. What have we done and what are we about to do that is great?
Well, I think that one could lay a considerable claim to the very success of Canadians in the course of the last 200 years in preserving a country and building a country with all the disparities of region and culture that have existed here. As to what we can do in the future, well, I guess as a historian I can only say that my particular hope is that we can do better in the future what we've been trying to do in the past, which is to work out this accommodation between various kinds of people in this country and provide, if you like, an example of the way in which it might possibly be done in the world. For I must say I feel very pessimistic if it turns out that French and English Canadians can't find a way of living together, then how are we going to live with the Chinese and the Africans and so on, who are so much more different from us than these two peoples are?
And more numerous.
And more numerous.
Do you see then Canadian history as being in some way, useful to other people insofar as our experience is common to the rest of the world?
Well, if we can work out the problems within the context of Canada, I think the experience would certainly be useful. It used to be said, you know, when new federations were being formed in Africa, that the Canadian Federation was a good example. Well, most of those federations have fallen apart in Africa, so maybe it wasn't a good example.
I hope that's not because Canadian academics went as consultants. They did in some cases.
That's true, they did. No, I think Canadian history, you see, and this is one of the ways in which I guess I'm against the stream in some elements of contemporary academic life. I'm terribly devoted to the study of Canadian history and Canadian culture and so on. But I always say to students, you can't understand anything about Canada if you only understand about Canada. You must know something about European history. You must know something about British history. You must know something about French history. And you certainly must know something about the United States, if that's possible. And that's why I think of the Canadian nation-state as being a laboratory of tremendous potential in which all kinds of experiments can be tried. That's why I think of it as a highly useful organization and one that deserves to be preserved. Just let me give you an example. You can try things within the federal system at a provincial level, which, if they work, can be tried in other provinces or maybe at the federal level, as was the case of the CCF in Saskatchewan. Some of the experiments there failed, some of them succeeded. But we learned in the rest of the country that medical health insurance was a good thing. Maybe you could say of social credit that they tried it in Alberta and the rest of the country didn't like it. But you can have those kinds of experiments, and that seems to me to be a great advantage of a federal system, that you can learn from the way in which other sections of the country do it. Or you can try it out on a scale that isn't going to be disastrous for everybody. And I think in that sense that this kind of federal Canadian nation-state experience may very well be a useful and valid one for other areas of the world who may indeed ultimately move in this kind of direction, although in fact right now we live in a period in which nationalism and ethnic consciousness, of course, is very strong again.
Yeah.